Hello everyone, welcome to Came Across Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're reaching towards the end of our book by J.P. Moreland, Scientism and Secularism, Learning to Respond to a Dangerous Ideology. And here again, we're talking about scientism, not about science. As Christians, we love science. It's one of the ways God has ordered the universe, and it's part of his thinking process. So we can't hate what God loves. That would be anti-Christian of us. And so again, we're talking about scientism, that all kind of the events of knowledge that comes to us can only be done through the advances of naturalistic only science. And so far, Moreland has kind of made the case that it's both self-defeating and wrong, which is helpful because then you can attack it two different ways. The first one probably being the self-defeating part being the most useful one, although people just like to tell people they're wrong too. So hopefully we've helped you in that to break it down a little bit. And so we're kind of getting to the point now where we're kind of reaching the end, and he starts chapter 13, which we're on here, by saying that before we turn to the next chapter, to how science and Christianity should be integrated, he wants to focus on this chapter on one bad way to put the two of them together, namely the strategy of methodological naturalism. So he titles this one, Methodological Naturalism, Theistic Evolution, and Intelligent Design. So then that's where we're going to launch off from here. So this is kind of like a good intermediary chapter to kind of show us where we've been and where we're going to before we close the book on another book here.
And he's going to spend most of this chapter, at least at the end, on criticizing methodological naturalism. Although he's going to, throw some criticisms at theistic evolution as well.
Which is always helpful as well.
Yeah.
Well, he says some of the leading critics of methodological naturalism today are proponents of intelligent design. So for intelligent design, against methodological naturalism. And I had to read that sentence about 6 different times and look up to make sure I understood what proponent was in order for me to get that. So that's why I'm over-explaining it here for future me to look back on and go, oh yes, I do remember that correctly. But many of its leading defenders, that is methodological naturalism defenders, are, on the other hand, are theistic evolutionists. So both theistic evolution and intelligent design are often undefined or misidentified. Sometimes they're brought into the same camp as well. So he says that we need to begin by clarifying what and whom we are talking about. And that's always a good thing to do, is define your terms.
There you go. So he's going to really briefly tell us a little bit about intelligent design. He's not really going to get into it a whole lot. And then really briefly talk about theistic evolution before he launches into his criticism of methodological naturalism. So what about intelligent design? Well, he says the intelligent design movement is an entire approach to science. And as such, it goes far beyond just the topic of, evolution. Right? He says, but when it comes to evolution, intelligent design proponents make at least 3 claims, although he's going to be focusing mainly on the third claim, which is the rejection of methodological naturalism. So the 3 claims are, and then we'll talk about each one of these in turn. Number 1, the blind watchmaker thesis is wrong. So that's the first claim that intelligent design proponents say. Secondly, intelligent design is a science. And then thirdly, methodological naturalism should be rejected. So those are the 3 claims that he wants to briefly deal with here in a way so that he can help us to understand what intelligent design is all about.
Right. So starting off with the blind watchmaker thesis is wrong. And of course, Ben Franklin being the most hurt of them all from this truth. The blind watchmaker thesis maintains there's no scientific evidence for appealing to an intelligent designer in order to explain the history of life and the existence of nature of living things and their parts. Rather, non-intelligent, purposeless, naturalistic processes are fully adequate to explain all the relevant scientific facts. So this could go from kind of that theism point of view to a non-theistic idea of life starts here.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of, I think it was Ben Stein who wrote the book Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
he was basically making a similar point here that you have to keep intelligence out of the scientific explanation process. And of course, the question is why, right? So,
and to show you how long ago that's been, I remember renting that movie from Netflix when they still sent you discs in the mail. So we've been hashing at it for a little bit and unable to make traction, even no matter who's in any type of house of any color at the top. So while advocates of intelligent designs demur and believe that intelligent design is a scientific model superior to the blind watchmaker thesis, and so it punches a little bit more, it makes more claims, and therefore is less, I think, kind of wishy-washy, because you can have this, I was reading Ben Franklin's autobiography, which is a kind of a weird read, because you think that he would get to the point of, the revolution, and he never does. But he's sure to tell you that, his idea of this general deism has come to him, and it's just because he hasn't been bothered anymore to put much more thought into it, and he doesn't really see a point to it. And so that's kind of him in a nutshell, and that's what I always think of when the blind watchmaker thesis comes about here.
All right. So that's the first one. It's a rejection of the blind watchmaker thesis. The blind watchmaker thesis is wrong. The blind watchmaker thesis says that we have to leave any talk of intelligence out of an explanation for science. And of course, intelligent design advocates say, no, that's not the case. We should use every, piece of information and explanation that we can when we come into scientific conclusions. All right, so what's the second one? The second one then is that indeed the proponents, as you would expect of intelligent design, say that intelligent design is a science, right? Proponents argue that the facts that justify an inference to an intelligent designer, and indeed the very inference itself, are properly construed as being within the domain of science. And so obviously the intelligent design folks want to suggest that intelligence design is a science. So that's the second one. And
which in the 90s, like that was the hot button issue of whether or not it was science. And it seemed like all the court cases that came about almost sidestepped it and was like, well, you're just trying to sneak religion into it. Separation of church and state, denied.
Yeah,
we won.
And he's going to suggest here later on in the chapter that you don't necessarily have to come from a religious perspective in order to hold an intelligent design position. So we'll see that as we go. All right, so that was the second one. Intelligent design is a science. And then thirdly, methodological naturalism should be rejected. He says proponents of intelligent design reject methodological naturalism. Roughly, it's the idea that while doing science, scientists must limit themselves to strictly naturalistic, materialistic explanations, right? So you only talk about naturalistic, materialistic explanations when doing science. And the intelligent design folks obviously reject that particular methodology, I guess.
Right. Again, you come across a log cabin in the woods. Well, there's wood here and wood in this house. To talk about anything of a person with an axe means that you're trying to sneak your log cabin maker extremism into the education of children. And therefore, you have to just assume they all fell within the structure around a stone masonry, and that's the end of it. So that's the only explanation that you get.
No intelligence.
Right, exactly. Okay, theistic evolutionists are theists, then, who believe that when it comes to scientifically detectable empirical evidence, the process by which evolution occurred are blind, purposeless, and naturalistic process with no goal-directed activity or supernatural intervention. So, that's the macro on up idea. So, we call, I think, even intelligent design people, creationists, all support the idea of microevolution, or as we just like to call it, change in species. And you have your speciation from there. And usually it's a breakdown of information. You don't add information to it. No matter how many kisses the frog gets, it will never turn into a prince. And no matter how much time you mix in there as well, it will never do that as well. So this kind of splits the baby, to use a biblical term here, by allowing for kind of God to jumpstart the process maybe a little bit down the way. If you're bowling and you're young, you have the gutter bumpers, and so God's the gutter bumpers that is kind of keeping life within the scope of the lane, so that it will hit the
so theistic evolutionists reduce God to gutter.
That's right.
Hey, got it.
Yep. When life is in the gutter, then you need God. So there you go. So that's the definition. But in some fairly unclear sense, God guided the process here for theistic evolutionists, but that is involvement by God is not detectable. And so, again, that's the big difference between intelligent design and theistic evolutionists. The physical universe, the world of atoms, subatomic particles, and things made of atoms, is the proper object of scientific study, and naturalism is the proper method of pursuing that study. And so you kind of put your Bible down, you leave that for Sunday, and you pick up your physics books that doesn't have any big G's in there, and then that's how the only way that you can pursue the study of science.
Yeah. And he makes a distinction here between methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism with regard to theistic evolutionists. And he says that the theistic evolutionist doesn't hold to philosophical naturalism, which is a metaphysical position, right? That only the physical world exists. But they do hold to methodological naturalism, which says that we should only explain by using the various physical processes. So that's a distinction there that he makes. All right, so that's theistic evolution. And so there's a distinction between intelligent design and theistic evolution. And now he wants to talk about the revival of methodological naturalism. And he says, though methodological naturalism is nothing new, it has experienced something of a revival, he suggests, in recent years. One Christian scholar, Paul de Vries, announced that the goal of natural science is to place events in the explanatory context of physical principles and laws and fields and that sort of thing. So only the physical that you can talk about, right? And thus the goal of natural science is to explain contingent natural phenomena strictly in terms of other contingent natural phenomena, right? Why did the pool, the ball, the cue ball hit the other ball? And why did the other ball react the way it did? Well, you only have physical processes that are involved. And so those are the only thing that you need to explain. Never mind that Fred, hit the ball himself, right? With the stick, right? With the cue stick. You can't allow that, right? You might be able to get the stick in there, but not Fred.
You get the big bang, but no banger.
That's right. Yeah. And so the goal of natural science, he says, to explain contingent natural phenomena strictly in terms of other contingent natural phenomena, and any appeal to personal causes and actions of human or supernatural agents is, as Ben Stein says, not allowed. Right. No intelligence allowed. So that's there it is, right? That's the revival of methodological naturalism.
So de Vries goes on to say then, a God hypothesis is both unnecessary and out of place within naturalistic scientific explanations. So this is, you're sticking too much into it. It's not necessary, and get it out of there. The idea that adding more complexities into a theory kind of hurts your theory more. And so de Vries is saying it's not necessary, it's out of place, and we just need to stick with the naturalistic processes here. A scientist may be able to measure the effects of an action of an agent, for example, the velocity of a ball thrown by a pitcher, but the free will mental act of the pitcher himself is outside the domain of physical science. Well, and again, scientism says here that we could never even constitute anything about a free will mental act because, unless you're just talking about the fluctuations of chemicals that make them throw a curveball rather than a knuckleball, that's the only thing that can happen within the scope of scientism, science. Well, in this case, methodological naturalism would require that science find a purely physical cause for the ball's velocity. It was caused by physical states in the brain according to the physical laws. So again, the firing of chemicals, the fizzing of their, how much sleep you got the night before, the stress levels, but no cause for those stresses, kids waking up in the middle of the night or anything like that. You can only talk about those naturalistic processes.
Right. All right. So there it is. Okay. So now he wants to talk about the divide then between intelligent design and theistic evolution. And he says what separates intelligent design theory and theistic evolution is not first and foremost metaphysical, right? And that's what we suggested a little bit earlier, right? Having to do with reality, since both affirm a creator. So they both affirm that, a creator exists, right? So that's not the distinction. As I mentioned, rather the fundamental divide between the two camps is epistemological. And this has to do with knowledge, right? And so the disagreement is whether there is objective, empirically detectable scientific evidence of God's design in biological history or phenomena. The intelligent design folks says, yes, there is. Theistic evolutionist says, no, there isn't.
So the question then is, why should Christians reject methodological naturalism? And that's what he moves on here. What should we make of methodological naturalism as a philosophy of science? He asks. He says, I believe Christians and even non-Christians should reject methodological naturalism for two reasons, one negative and one positive. So here he's going to make the case not just from a Christian perspective, but for an anybody perspective. We'd want more people on the Christian side, but we'll take what we can get here at least.
We'll take the anybody perspectives.
That's right. But we'll give both the negative and positive here. So the first one, the case of methodological naturalism has not been made. So negatively, we should reject the naturalism of the methodological persuasion because its advocates have failed to make their case. They rely on a line of demarcation between science and non-science that consists in stating a set of necessary or sufficient conditions for something to count as science.
Right. So the idea here is that there's a line that can be drawn between science and non-science, a big, bright, we might say red line, right, that we can clearly see. And on this side is all the things that are science, and on this side is all the things that are non-science. And he says, nope, that doesn't exist. We haven't found a way to draw that line yet. That's where he's going with this. There is no line. We can't find a line. We don't know how to draw a line, right? And so he says methodological naturalists say that we can come up with certain conditions that are both necessary, they have to be there, and sufficient, they have causal mechanisms, right, for science to be practiced. And so there's, if you think about it, so if you think about rain, for instance, right? Notice clouds are necessary for rain, but they're not sufficient. So you need clouds, they need to be there, but they don't directly, just because you have clouds doesn't mean you have rain, right? Not sufficient for rain. So that's kind of the distinction. And so he says, just as one problem with that proposal, this idea that, we can come up with necessary and sufficient conditions for science, he says is that no one has ever been able to draw such a line. It simply doesn't exist. So that's his claim. That's the negative problem. They haven't made their case. There is no line that we can see. And so then he gives us some examples. He says, consider the following criteria that have been offered throughout the years as conditions for something to count as science. So how do we know that something counts as science? Well, he gives us a list of a bunch of things here. So I'll rattle them off here. And then he suggests that none of these really work, right? So what does it mean for something to count as science? Well, it's focused on the natural or physical world, or it's guided by natural law, or it's explainable by reference to natural law, or it's empirically testable, or it's held tentatively, or it's falsifiable, or it's measurable or quantifiable, or it involves predictions, or perhaps it's repeatable. So here's a list then of things that throughout the years that folks said, if these are the case, then that thing, whatever it is, whatever you're trying to explain, counts as science. And of course, he's going to suggest, no, these don't work.
Right. And so a lot of these you might have heard, repeatable. All right, well, start before the creation of the universe and do it again. Oh, okay, so the universe just doesn't exist. And so yeah, all these things of, falsifiability, those tend to be referenced quite heavily, especially in YouTube comments. So here, again, he's saying, these considerations have been made. No one's been able to draw them. And sometimes the science over provides us with answers that fall outside these lines here. All right, so that's the big list, but he says that not one of these conditions individually and no set of them collectively is necessary or sufficient for counting as a science. They are examples of science that do not have a particular one of the criteria in question. Thus, the criterion is not the necessary ingredient of science. And these are examples of non-science that do have the criterion. Thus, the criterion is not sufficient for defining science.
Right. So on the one hand, we have, examples of science that do not have a particular one of these criteria, right? So they're not necessary. If it's necessary, it has to have it. But there are examples of science where they don't have any of these, and yet we would still call it science. And so these aren't necessary. On the other hand, there are examples of non-science that do have these criteria. Right. Well, that means that the criteria then is not sufficient for something to be defined as science. If indeed area is clearly non-science, but it has this particular issue, right? Example, then clearly that can't be what science is. And so it doesn't work for necessary nor sufficient conditions for science.
Right.
He gives us an example. He says, must science, for instance, be held tentatively? Right? Oh, well, what are we talking about here? Right? Something is scientific if it's held tentatively. Well, notice what he says here. He says, and the idea here is tentatively. Held tentatively means that it's not the last word, that we could change our mind and that kind of stuff, right? But he says, this is a strange proposal, for notice it's irrelevant to the definition of science itself, to be held tentatively. What does that got to do with science, right? This is about the inner conscious states of scientists rather than their compelling views. And so, what does the inner conscious state of a scientist have to do with defining a particular methodology as scientific? He's suggesting none, right? So, being held tentatively isn't a workable criteria. And he says, besides, sometimes some scientists hold their views dogmatically, so they don't hold them tentatively, right? And so, in fact, while some theologians hold their views tentatively. So does that mean their theological, positions are scientific because of their inner conscious states? Oh, no. And so he says this criteria really tells us nothing about science and its definition or condition. So that one tentatively, being held tentatively, doesn't really work with regard to what is necessary and sufficient for something to be science.
All right. Well, how about it holds to a natural law? It's reference.
We can write it
down on a piece of paper. We can put it in the Texas school book, and they're forced to read it and reference it. That's a key part of genuine science when it comes to explaining why something occurred. Well, again, it's difficult to take this seriously as a compelling criteria when there are examples in science of explanations that do not require an appeal to natural laws, especially in historical science, where reference is made to a single casual event to explain something, like archaeology. So archaeology can't be a science, right? You have this one event, it's over, it's done, it's buried, and you can't even dig it up because it doesn't really exist until you hold it in your mind. So it fails on two ways. But we would call archaeology a science. And again, that demarcation line seems to be a little bit more fuzzy and less red.
That's right. All right. So that's the one side of it, right? He's suggesting that methodological naturalism, the proponents of that, haven't really made their case. There is no necessary and sufficient conditions to call something science, right? And so if that's the case, then as he's suggesting, a methodological naturalism hasn't made its case. So this is the negative side, right?
Right. And so we're paused for this one, and we've kind of presented the problem. We've made at least the first inroads into the rejection of methodological naturalism. And so next time we'll make a positive case for the negation of methodological naturalism. So that's what we'll do next time. And so again, there's still time to pick up with the book. As always, you can go back and to all our books, caveofthecross.com. All the books are listed right in the middle of the page. You can click on those and get all the thumbnails that will take you to each individual episode, and you can watch at your leisure there. And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.